Andrew is going to be speaking to you guys today about performance anxiety. I met him in Miami, and we performed there, and we did other things. We took classes. After that, he went up to the Atlantic Music Festival in Maine, and he performed there. He did a lecture there, and after that, he traveled all the way to California, and then he went to Nevada, played in the Burning Man Festival, and then he went to DC, performed in the Australian Embassy, and now he's in New York again, and he's going to be talking to you guys. So, I'd like to introduce you to Andrew Rumsey.
Hi everyone. How you doing? Can you hear me okay?
Okay.
Yes, you can hear me?
What did you ask?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, so we have two things going on. We have you having an Australian accent that we have to get used to. And then we have the speaker sound system. So
Well, I apologize for the accent.
do not.
I can't do much about that. So thanks, Quinn. This is a lecture discussion that I gave at the Atlantic Music Festival on the brain and memory and performance anxiety and how our brain functions when we perform. It doesn't have to be just with music, but it can be with public speaking or acting or things like that. Memory is such a fundamental part of learning, and it's a very interesting phenomenon to see how the brain actually reacts under pressure. I have been playing piano since I was 8 years old and have been performing for the last 9 or 10 years. And when I was an undergraduate student at the Australian National University, I was always interested in the brain and psychology, so I studied it for a few years there. So what I wanted to talk about today is I wanted to talk a little bit about memory first. Have you all got your handouts there?
Yes.
Yes? Fantastic. Okay, so we'll fly through some of that. For anyone who's watching on Facebook Live that doesn't have these handouts, please feel free to private message me and I'll send them to you. It is not an academic paper. The referencing is non-existent. It was only there if you wanted to do any further reading. So to start off with, I wanted to talk about processes of memory. So this is a very, very huge topic that we're just going to cover a very tiny amount on. Basically, we have three processes of memory that we use every day. We have working memory, which is a type of short memory, and working memory is when we manipulate a piece of information. So when we are translating or problem solving or trying to argue something, we're often manipulating information in our working memory. Short-term memory, according to Miller's law, is about 7 items plus or minus 2. So it's of very limited capacity and only a few seconds. Long-term memory is of unlimited capacity for unlimited duration until you die, and then you can't remember anything anymore. So in order to get from short-term memory to long-term memory, it takes a lot of consolidation and effort, so we're going to work through some of those things. So if you look on page 2, I very briefly talk about different types of memory. Now, a lot of them could be across different disciplines, but specifically this applies to music performance, instrumental, and it's a very summarized list. There's a lot of different subheadings in here which I didn't talk about. So muscle memory, it's an automatic thing. When you do something enough times, it just becomes automatic. So it's like riding a bike, texting, putting in a PIN number. Oral memory is how you recognize the sound of something, so you can hear the beginning of a piece of music. That is in the oral cortex of your brain. Visual memory is in the visuospatial sketch pad, and that has big variability depending on what kind of the person you are. Some people have a bit of a photographic memory, and lucky them. Analytical memory, so when you analyze a piece of music. Glenn Gould always said that the best way to learn a piece of music was away from the instrument. An emotional memory. This is one that's not actually talked about that much, but when you use emotion for memory, you actually are reinforcing the stimulus because it creates the same physiological condition that heightens memory retention. So if everyone in the room there can remember a moment where they felt great triumph, when you felt that you were victorious over something, you overcame something difficult, you did really well on an exam, or that you performed really well in a sports carnival, or something like that, you can remember how that feels because it was a very powerful emotion. If you feel when you are very much in love, or when you are very, very sad, heightened senses of emotions are actually a very good reinforcer of memory. So that's why that one made the list. Okay, so before we get into the fight or flight response, what happens when we get nervous? Why do we get nervous? Typically we get nervous because we care about the outcome. You all care about the art that you do and how you share it with other people. And so obviously you are invested in how that comes across, how you deliver what you have spent a lot of time perfecting. So if you didn't get nervous, then you wouldn't really care about how you delivered that. So I think that getting nervous is very much a natural thing, and as we're going to go through, you'll see that it's very much a biological thing that happens that we don't really have a lot of control over. Now, can everyone understand me okay? Is the camera still working all right? Can you all still see me? Is that all good?
Yeah, the camera's fine. Sometimes you're cutting out though.
Okay.
A little bit.
And I'm sure the accent doesn't help. So.
If it starts to cut out, just let us know.
Yeah, just
right.
flail your arms and I'll stop. Yes, great. Okay, so the fight or flight response has been biologically carried through for people for millions of years. And so it was very much useful to, if we had to fight or run away from a predator, whether it be a saber-toothed tiger or something like that. It was very much something that we are inherently born with. Now, when we get nervous when we are acting or performing or speaking in front of people, that is because we perceive a threat, which is not actually accurate. So a threat is perceived and the autonomic nervous system puts the body on alert. So there's several things that happen. We often get hot, we start to sweat more, our heart rate increases, we breathe more heavily, our blink rate increases, and that's all because the adrenal cortex automatically releases a class of hormone called glucocorticoids, which is glucose plus cortex plus steroids, and the main one of those is cortisol. Now, cortisol is fantastic for metabolic function, for cardiovascular, our immune system, but it actually has some bad side effects with our memory, which is why I wanted to include memory in this talk. So, an excess of cortisol in the bloodstream can impair the ability of the hippocampus to both encode and recall memories. So when we get on stage or we get up in front of other people and we feel nervous, the main stress hormone that is released into our bloodstream, although it has many benefits if we actually have to fight or flight, but it actually impairs our working and long-term memory retrieval, which often causes us to have memory lapses or to get mixed up and forget what we're saying. So although it's a very primal thing that has been quite useful for us, it often works against us in performance situations. So even though we perceive a threat when we get up to perform or speak or act, the threat isn't always accurate. So on page 3, I found the best case study that I could find on music performance anxiety in skilled pianists. So they found 7 men and 11 women of a mean age of 26 years, so average age of 26, with an average of 20 years piano playing. And they got them to perform in 2 different performance conditions. One was on a Yamaha Baby Grand piano in a practice room, and one was on a Steinway D concert grand in front of a jury of 5 panelists and an audience. The competition scenario had a financial reward. I can't remember how much it was, but there was very much a difference in the performance situations, both of which were recorded, however, and later judged by the same panel members. So if you have a look on page 3 to the little diagram that I have there, A refers to the heart rate and B refers to the sweat rate of the individuals. So you can see there is a big difference between the rehearsal and the competition condition. So everyone's heart rate and sweat rate went up considerably in the competition condition. And if you have a look on page 4, the table that I have there shows how the performances were graded. So the 5 judges, who were 4 concert pianists and 1 musicologist, evaluated the recorded performance. And you can see in the table they used 10 variables that they measured and gave them a score out of 10, 1 being poor and 10 being excellent. You can also see that the rehearsal scored much better in every condition than in the competition conditions. So accuracy, technical dexterity, tempo and rhythm, memory, artistry, interpretation, expressiveness, structural strength, melodic and harmonic balance, and tone quality were all better when they were in a less stressful situation. In brackets, you'll see the standard deviation. Standard deviation is a measure of dispersion. So it tells us how close all of the scores were. If you have a large standard deviation, it means that the scores weren't really significant. So the smaller your standard deviation is, the closer all of the scores are to that particular reading. So we can see that 1.4, 1.3, 1.8, all of them are quite significant. So we can see that there really is a difference between the competition and the rehearsal situation. So the high levels of autonomic arousal, despite being an evolutionary adaptive response in life-threatening situations, also had a detrimental effect on the temporal perception. Participants typically performed faster in the competition condition than in rehearsal. An increase in arousal accelerated the individual's inherent rate of activity, which might explain the reason why performing tempo increased in the competition condition. Has anyone come off stage or listened to a recording of their monologue or their performance and gone, gee, that was so much slower than I thought it was? Has anyone had that? No. Everyone typically performs much faster when they get nervous. Every recording I've listened to, I always go, gee, why did I play it so fast? So, Horowitz, Ella Fitzgerald, Paul McCartney, Barbra Streisand, Chopin, Emile Gilels, they all hated performing. They all loved their craft, but they hated performing. Chopin, who is one of the poets of the piano said that the audience intimidates him and he's not fit to performing. When I was at the Atlantic Music Festival, one of the teachers there said that she was able to meet Emil Gilels, who is a famous concert pianist back in Russia. He's passed away now, but he was very much a well-known artist back in the day. And she got to meet him backstage, and she said to him, Mr. Gilels, how do you not get nervous? And he said, not get nervous? I mean, you need to imagine a big, thick Russian accent at this point. He said, I have a doctor backstage because every time I perform, I nearly have a heart attack. And he said, I'm very, very lucky because when I perform, my hands never shake, only my knees. So it's something that affects all of us to more or less extent. And there's a number of theories of why and how, and hopefully in the lecture we're going to talk about some of the things that we can do to reduce those feelings. So hopefully we'll fly through some of these theories. These are just ones that I thought would be the most relevant to all of you. These are theories of performance anxiety in sport and emergency medicine. They're not just music related, so I think they were worth mentioning. So the threat challenge assessment, which is Lazarus's cognitive appraisal theory from 1984 on page 5. It is important to note that an individual's response to stress is heavily influenced by an individual's assessment of the situation. First, we assess the demands of the situation, which is what is required of us to achieve the goal. Next, we assess the resources, which is personal, environmental, that we have available to achieve that goal. When resources are sufficient to deal with the demand, we frame the situation as a challenge, and a positive psychological state of eustress ensues that supports optimal performance. When demands outweigh resources, we see a threat, and a negative psychological state of distress results that can impair performance. So when we feel that we're in a situation that our abilities, whether it be our technical skills or the amount of practice that we've done or the amount of time available to prepare for a certain task, when we feel that those things are sufficient to meet the demands of the challenge, we have a challenge assessment and we frame things in a much more positive way. If we feel that we haven't had sufficient time or the technical skills required are too great for us, then we see a threat assessment, which is much less desirable. So we need to not catastrophize the worst case scenario. So when we look at a given performance situation, if we think, what is the worst case scenario? If we stumble and muck up our words, if we have a memory lapse in a piece of music and play a few wrong notes, what is the worst case scenario? What will happen? We may not have given our best portrayal of our skill or have communicated a message that we wanted to. But in the big scheme of things, that's not that bad. I've seen some of the world's best concert musicians who've made mistakes but have given a completely emotionally convincing performance, and I for one would much rather see that than something that was technically and robotically perfect. So if you think, what is the worst case scenario, and the fact that realistically in the big scheme of things it's not that bad, and then on the other side of the coin you think, what is the likelihood that that worst case scenario is going to happen? If you've done all of your practice the way that you are supposed to, and are gaining lots of experience in presenting these skills under stressful situations, then the worst case scenario is actually unlikely. So if you think that the worst case scenario is not all that bad and the likelihood of it actually happening is quite low, it actually helps us frame things in a much more realistic way. So when you get nervous, if you put things more in perspective, that actually helps reduce the stress of the situation, I find. So at the bottom of page 5, the Yerkes and Dodson inverted U-curve from 1901. The research on how we perform under pressure is somewhat mixed. Some studies indicate impaired performance under pressure, while others have demonstrated improved performance. For simple or well-learned tasks, the relationship can be considered linear, with improvements in performance as arousal increases. For complex or unfamiliar tasks, the relationship becomes inverse, with declines in performance as arousal increases. So if you have a look at the diagram on the next page, on page 6, we can see that if we don't have enough arousal, if we're not excited enough, I'm sorry there's so many pages here, then our performance level is low. If you ever see someone at the Olympics about to walk onto the track yawning and they're not really fired up, they're not going to be at the optimal performance level. When you get too aroused, you're too nervous, the body's on too much of an alert, then performance quality decreases as well. So ideally we want a little bit of nerves. So a little bit of performance anxiety is actually a good thing. It's preparing our body for what we're about to do. So the optimal zone or flow for any activity, there is a balance between our skill, resources, and the demands being placed on us. If the demands are greater than resources, which is a threat assessment, we see anxiety and poor performance. When the skill or confidence is greater than the demands, we see boredom that could also degrade performance. Somewhere in between, there is a zone that leads to optimal performance, which is the Goldilocks state, which is our state of flow. Now, if we have a look on page 7, at the top of page 7, as mentioned in the threat challenge assessment, personal appraisal, so our perception of the situation, whether we view it as a threat or a challenge, plays an important role in the interpretation of our anxiety systems. We can either interpret our increased heart rate, our increased sweat rate, heavy breathing, loss of appetite. We can choose to view all of those things as a negative thing or a positive thing. And the diagram shows you that it suggests that anxiety symptoms may be perceived as facilitative, so positive for the performance, or as debilitative, which is negative for performance. The relationship between anxiety and performance may be significantly affected by the way performers perceive their symptoms. So the way you choose to interpret your feelings of performance anxiety will affect how you perform. So that's quite an important thing. Multidimensional anxiety theory, I think we can skip over briefly. Basically just says that we have two types of performance anxiety. One is cognitive, which is often it starts quite a while before the performance, whereas somatic anxiety, which is the physical effects of our performance anxiety, happens generally right before the performance, so 6 hours more or less. So that's what that diagram says. The catastrophe model from 1987 by Lou Hardy. It predicts the human behavior and performance rather than explaining how it occurs. So if you have a look there, I know that this diagram looks a bit complicated on page 8, but it basically says that if we have a high level of cognitive anxiety, so we've worked ourselves up that this is a very stressful situation, and we have a high level of physical anxiety, so the sweats, the blinking, the breathing, the heart rate, then we have a very unfortunate catastrophe model scenario. So ideally, we want to have a high level of cognitive anxiety, but a low level of physiological stuff. So we've talked about some theories on what performance anxiety is, how it affects us, and basically what it does. So, linking memory and anxiety on page 9. It has been proved in numerous medical fields of study that stress has a variety of impacts on memory. Working memory seems to be impaired in the context of a threat assessment, whereas no impairment results from a challenge assessment. In terms of memory retrieval, same thing. Stress impairs those who assess the situation as a threat as opposed to a challenge. So that's a really important thing. Our memory is impaired depending on whether we perceive the situation as a threat as opposed to a challenge. When we get really nervous and there is an increased level of cortisol in our bloodstream, that affects our working memory application and our long-term memory retrieval. So, in order to help our brain function at its best under a stressful situation, we need to try and be as less nervous as possible. So that's the ideal situation. So some of the things that we can do is meditation or mindfulness. Wholeheartedly accepting the situation as it is, what you're about to do. You're about to stand up and deliver whatever your art form is with an audience, which is, if you think about it, which is why we do what we do. We want to share something with other people. That is the whole point of music or drama or acting. We're doing something creative in order to share something special with other people. That's what it's about, not about avoiding the mistakes or remembering all of the words or that sort of stuff. That's all a byproduct. You need to think of why you're doing what you're doing and what you're trying to communicate. So thinking about that and meditating for 15 to 30 minutes can offer significant reductions in cortisol levels. So studies have indicated that mindfulness can improve our ability to control focus and attention, improve working memory, and help emotional self-regulation, which is the acknowledgement of and acceptance of your emotions. So, next page. This is a really useful one. This is something that I incorporate all the time now. Stress inoculation training, which is also called stress exposure training. It's a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that involves 3 steps. So education or cognitive preparation, which is what this is. You are learning about what happens when you get nervous. 2 is the skill acquisition and rehearsal, which is what I hope all of you are going to do after this lecture. And 3 is the application, so what you actually do in performance. Last year I did my licentiate diploma for the Royal School of Music, and it was a very, very stressful exam, and I prepared for it for a number of months. So the way I applied this stress inoculation training was I had 6 concerts with that same program before the exam. I played it once for my family and friends. I then played it for all of my neighbors. I then played it at a house concert with 20 or 30 people there. I then played it for a smaller concert in Sydney, and then 2 big concerts back to back in Canberra. And so each time I was encountering a stressful situation with the same material. And so by the time my exam came around, it did feel like a very rehearsed thing. I had learnt to cope with the feelings and the stress in the same situation that I'd been in earlier. So if you practice in a practice room, or you go over your monologues or things like that, and then suddenly throw yourself into a different situation where you have a lot of people staring at you, that's a very big change. If you can reduce the significance of that change by rehearsing in less stressful situations prior, that's actually a very, very useful tool. If you were to only take away 3 things from this whole lecture, that would be one of them. I would certainly recommend practicing that. Performance breathing. This is the second thing that I would encourage all of you to do. Every time I perform now, I stand backstage and I do a square breathing, which is where you breathe in for 4, you hold for 4, you breathe out for 4, hold for 4. The reason for controlling your breathing is you can't control your heart rate, but you can control your breathing. And if you can do that, that will affect your heart rate by slowing it down that way. So it's actually a very helpful tool to use. Overlearning. Now this is something that we all tend to do. So on page 11, how am I doing for time? Okay. One thing that I learned quite early on is when I'd have a difficult passage on the piano, I would practice it over and over and over and over again. And I'd get into this loop where I would just practice that phrase and link it to the beginning of that same phrase. So one time I came into a performance and I got stuck in that loop because that's how I had rehearsed it. So you need to practice things in the way that you want to perform them. I remember one funny, well, not really funny, terrifying situation. It was a police officer, I think it was in New York, where what the officer did is, in order to practice disarming someone who had a gun, he practiced with his partner over and over again. So he would get his partner officer at any point in time, they're lining up for food, he'd pull out his gun and point it at his head, and he would need to turn around and disarm. Then came the time when he was actually attending a house robbery and came face to face with an armed robber. And he was able to disarm the robber and then handed the gun back to the robber. So that's a case where overlearning and getting stuck in that sort of loop can be a bad thing. So it is often a good idea when you read something out in front of the mirror or practice something, try and think of it in a performance context. And that is also another useful tool to use. Self-talk. The greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another. So how we think shapes how we see the world. So the way we talk through certain situations, or the way we reframe or reappraise our situation, has a really big effect on the outcome that we want. Okay, now we're going to page 12. So cognitive reappraisal is the centerpiece of cognitive behavioral therapy and is the process of modifying our assessment of a situation in order to alter its emotional impact. Reminding ourselves this is just another performance, or it's not the end of the world, or life goes on, all of these things help lessen the emotional impact of the scenario. So another form of cognitive reframing is to acknowledge the physiological changes of stress. Rather than viewing them as a hindrance or distraction, reframing them as a beneficial sign that the body is operating at its peak level. So our emotions are neither inherently harmful nor beneficial. Emotions become harmful when they are the wrong intensity for the wrong duration, occur with the wrong frequency, or are the wrong type for a particular situation. The effectiveness of cognitive reframing is a reminder that stress is transactional. Stress is neither an external aggravation nor an internal response. It is an interaction between our thoughts and our environment. Okay, so that's page 12. Okay, so if we go to page 13. Negative thoughts are common, but the most difficult part of dealing with them is noticing that they are happening and that they are automatic. Okay, so when we are affected by nerves, it is an automatic function that we have no control over. How we perceive the situation, the skills available to us, the unlikelihood of the worst case scenario, and the fact that the worst case scenario is not all that bad, all of these things help us reevaluate the situation that we're in and hopefully help us feel less nervous. So what other things can we do to reduce the release of stress hormones? So time outdoors, studies show that physical settings play a role in stress reduction, and being in nature is a well-documented way to promote relaxation. In Japan, they have had this trend of forest bathing, where people will walk through the forest to help reduce stress and anxiety, and it's quite a popular thing. So time outdoors and in nature, spending time at the ocean, all of these things help aid anxiety reduction. Exercise. According to research published by Harvard Medical School, regular exercise of moderate intensity is one of the best ways to manage stress, balance hormones, sleep better, and aid normal metabolic function. Listening to soothing music. Studies have shown that calming music can help reduce the elevation of cortisol. Essential oils, a lot of performers I know swear by this. So lavender, myrrh, frankincense, and bergamot contain potent active ingredients that have been shown to naturally lower cortisol. Sleep. Now this is a really important one. Sleep helps us control cortisol production, but having high cortisol can make it hard to rest. They actually did a study at the German Institute for Aerospace Medicine, and they got a group of pilots, and for 7 nights, half of the pilots slept for 6 hours, and the other half slept for 8 hours. And what they found was the ones that had 6 hours of sleep had a 50% higher level of cortisol, so the main stress hormone, in their bloodstream than those who had 8 hours sleep. So sleep is really important for performing at your optimum level. In general terms, memory consolidation takes place with repetition and review. The more something is repeated and used, the more neuronal connections the brain makes, wherein the neural pathways used for specific information becomes stronger. So whenever you are practicing your lines or your music or your speech or whatever, consolidation is key. So repetition in different contexts, in different stressful situations, is really important. So there's some extra memorization tips for you. And then to finish off before I play you some music, I'd just like to read a final note by Alan Watts. So, at the end of the day, we are all striving for the ideal performance, the best of our best. Unfortunately, the desire for a more positive experience is itself a negative experience. And paradoxically, the acceptance of one's negative experience is itself a positive experience. Any attempt to escape the negative, to avoid it or quash it or silence it, only backfires. The avoidance of suffering is a form of suffering. The avoidance of struggle is a struggle. The denial of failure is a failure. Everything worthwhile in life is won through surmounting the associated negative experience. So, I'm not sure if you guys have any questions. I think the main take-home message for all of this is that stress when performing is a very natural, automatic thing, which is biologically infused within us. All we can do is accept the effects it has on us and try and take steps to get used to and control those feelings. The biological thing that happens with the release of cortisol, with all of the heart rate and sweat rate and everything like that, all of that has been very beneficial in our evolution, but kind of works against us in this instance. So all we can do is get used to feeling those feelings and applying our skills that we acquire, our experience in different situations, to hopefully portray a emotionally convincing performance of whatever we're doing. So I hope everything I've said makes sense, and I apologize for my Australian accent. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Did everything make sense? Was there anything that was unclear?
Makes sense.
Fantastic. Well, it was very nice to see all of you guys there. I hope that you continue to do what you do. When we share music or art or literature or whatever with other people, it brings something very special to humanity, and I think that it's a very important thing that all of you are doing. So keep doing it, love what you do, and bring some of yourself to whatever you're doing, and change people's lives that way. So I'm now going to perform some Rachmaninoff for you. I've finished my summer repertoire program, so this is a piece I've just stumbled across that I've fallen in love with. So I hope you enjoy the Rachmaninoff piece I'm going to play. And if there's no other questions, then I'll sit at the piano.
Sounds great.
Go ahead.
Brilliant.
Let's maybe bring this closer so it doesn't echo as much. That's-
And thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience. So.
Thank you very much.
Okay, that's probably where the...
yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That's too much, man. Okay.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Do you guys
Cool.
have any questions before? Go? No, nothing? All right. Well, thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. So,
Very much. Thank you
Yep.
very much.
Thank you, guys.
thank you.
See you later.